Okay, my name is Bo Cisco, and I am the president and lead instructor of the Behavioral Analysis Training Group. And this webinar is on applying the threat assessment that's used in some of my training, most notably the training class that is Behavioral and Psychological Indicators of School Shooters and Mass Violence. That's a 24 or 40-hour class, depending on the format, and it deals with the behavioral and psychological indicators, traits, personality types, and history that makes a student susceptible to those type of behaviors. Now, what I want to do is take that, kind of crunch it down a little bit and talk about the threat assessment. You don't need the whole rest of the class to just look at the threat assessment. And I know that we have some teachers here, we probably have some law enforcement here. So I want to apply it equally so everyone can get something out of this. Now there is, like I said, I always hope someone will take one of my longer classes because I get to go into a little more detail on it. But this is just going to be the threat assessment part, and I will go into as much history as I can. So I'd also like to thank some of the security agencies and private schools that have taken this video and will be using it for their teachers' annual training. That's it means more to me than you know. More information I can get out on this, the better. Okay, like I said, my name is Bo Cisco. A little about me. I am a 22-year veteran of law enforcement, still going. And during that time, I've worked on my bachelor's in social psychology, my master's in forensic psychology. My draw and my passion is violence and why do people commit it and how can we understand and recognize what they're doing before violence occurs. And that reasonably led me into the realm of school shooters and students in crisis. I don't like to use the term school shooter because really that's the end result of a long road. There is, outside the world of severe mental illness, there's very little, if any stories that I've ever heard of that where a normal, well-adjusted student woke up one day and said, I'm going to shoot up a school and did it. There's normally I won't say normally, there's always a long past that comes along with that. And it's a buildup. Now, as I go through some of these threat assessment items that students have built up over time, I want to just tell you about something that I've experienced when I've taught this in class. When I've gone and taught this to strictly teachers, I have showed slides of the psychological and behavioral indicators of certain school shooters. And I just list them up on a slide on the board. And what really made me focus on this class so much is that every time I've done that, especially around teachers, SROs and school police also, but in some cases, the SROs don't know the students as intimately as the teachers do, especially in large schools. Teachers have always said, I have that student in my class. Just looking at the indicators, I could put a name on that slide right now of my student. And I hit a little button and it shows the name of a school shooter that we all know a name of. I'll go to the next one, show a list of behaviors. Another teacher, I know that student. I could put a name on that student, but they're not a school shooter. I hit the number, I hit the button, and another picture comes up, shows about, shows the name of another school shooter. So these are the indicators that this person gave, after when they looked at all his background, this is what they found. So the question comes up, how come I can tell you over the course of my career, a bunch of students that had these indicators, but never became school shooters? And the easy, simple answer for that is they didn't reach their breaking point. I believe, and when I show you these indicators in my threat assessment, I hope you understand too, that schools are teeming with potential school shooters. And that sounds bad. That sounds like, the sky's falling kind of talk, which I don't really like. But we all know that teen years are tough on kids. It was tough on all of us, whether you're well-adjusted or whether you're weird or whether, you got issues. It's a tough time for all students. But what we're looking for are students in crisis. And in those students in crisis, not saying that every one of them is going to turn into a school shooter, but they're all in that category of teetering on that road or going down that road to where they're going to do something worse than just be someone in crisis. Eventually, they're going to reach out. They're going to lash out on something. And there are definite indicators that show when they're getting close to that. And that's what we're going to go over. Now, the one thing I always bring up, and this isn't a question so much where I want you to just, raise your hand and say, hey, we have this, but think about this. The majority of the schools, security agencies, school police departments that I've gone and talked to about this topic, very few, if any. And when I say if any, it's not a lot. No one has a plan. That if I give you this threat assessment and you take it back to your school and you find a student that hits every point, what do you do with this? I've talked to some schools and they say, well, it's a law enforcement problem. We would report that child to law enforcement. Well, me coming from law enforcement looks at this threat assessment and says, there's not a lot on here that's committing a crime. So who does it go to? Does the school normally has guidance counselors? Yeah, but guidance counselors normally are not counselors as far as psychological counselors. They're, they handle the small problems, they guide kids on their way, but are guidance counselors in your school ready to handle significant behavioral indicators to do long-term counseling? The answer I've gotten for the most part is no. A couple of schools employ a counselor, which is a great start, an actual social worker or psychological counselor. That's a great start, but some schools don't have access to that. Some schools don't have a program set up to where if somebody hits these threat assessment, what do they do with that student in the meantime? If law enforcement says, yeah, it looks pretty bad, but we don't have a crime to take him away, we can't just lock him in a cage for having problems, being in crisis, the school may not be able to remove them. Are there special schools? And I just go on that one of the big problems with this whole topic is, what do we do when we find somebody? And there comes the issue. And I'm going to go into why it's a bigger problem than we think as we go into the threat assessment. So I want to go into a little about what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to go into the threat assessment areas are 5. 1, psychological issues, medical issues, social, family, and then red flags. So there's 5 areas that I employ a threat assessment in. Now, will someone who hits a lot of these areas become a school shooter? The answer is, I can't tell you that. No one can tell you that. But what I can tell you is the students in crisis, and that should be what we're dealing with. A school shooter is the end result. A student in crisis is still malleable, is still being able to turn off this path into something more positive. So the most important thing you can do is recognize the early and middle and even the end phases that when they go through in order to change that direction. Now, will some people that have all these threat assessment areas go on to live a normal life? Sure. If the situation changes, if the dynamics change, and you're going to see a lot of teachers may say, well, I see someone who hits a threat assessment in my class, but yet that person graduated last year and they do just fine. Of course, situation changes. They're going to be under the pressure of being in school, under the different social dynamics. So there's where it comes in a little bit of a, it's not as black and white as I would like it to be. I'd love to be able to give you, here's 10 things. If they hit these 10 things, they're definitely going to do this, and you can do what you need to do with them. It's not going to be that simple. So I want to focus on the terminology of student in crisis, because that's the building blocks of what we're looking for, not so much a shooter or someone already engaged in violence, because that's a different class. And if you took the longer classes, we do talk about how to assess behaviors of people coming on campus. If you were to believe that there was someone coming on campus with a weapon, what the indications are, what different behavioral aspects are of suspicious behavior, of concealing behaviors, of other behaviors. That's a different part of the longer class. This is the threat assessment. So I want to get into the first of psychological assessments. So when we look at the anatomy of a student in crisis, the first thing we want to do is let's look at the psychological history. What does a person have that might let us know that there is an issue? Now, people say, well, HIPAA, we can't know this, we can't know this. I know that as a school, you may not have access to medical records. but I've come across a tremendous amount of school resource officers and teachers and guidance counselors who knew the psychological diagnosis of kids because the kid either was open about it or they recognized the behaviors that are associated with that. So now there's a lot that go on with psychological indicators in kids, because I look back at high school and I look back at a lot of the kids there, and you look at psychological indicators, and we all seem to be we all have a little bit going on during those times. Most of us grow out of it. A lot of kids are depressed. They have certain issues going on. There's hormones, there's puberty, there's all these things going on. So there's a lot of psychological things going on with kids at that point. And what we're looking for is diagnosis of psychological personality disorders. Do they have a history of calling suicide hotlines? Have they made thoughts or made statements about suicidal thoughts? Now, I know these are kind of like, yeah, whatever. Okay, this is pretty ground ball type of stuff. And it is, but this is just the beginning. I'm talking about psychological and personality disorders. There's a lot of that going on. In fact, most statistics indicate that only 25% of teens with psychological or personality disorders are actually diagnosed. So that means only 1 in 4 has been taken to a professional and says you have this diagnosis, which means 75% of them are running around undiagnosed, and those behaviors are not being monitored, they're not being medicated, they're not being counseled. So they're really going to be, depending on what it is, it could continue to ratchet itself up, as many psychological and personality disorders do. If they're not addressed, they might get worse over time. So we're looking for people that are acting in these certain ways. Are they depressed? Do they have different personality disorders? Are they on some sort of medication? Now, medication is a big deal because many people aren't taking it correctly. Are the children being monitored? Do you know if the parents being involved with these types of medication? Now, a very large percentage of people involved in mass violence in schools were all taking SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, basically the antidepressants. And they're a class of drug that are pretty popular with this age and type of behaviors. So almost every one of them was taking some sort of SSRI. That's important because that means they're all diagnosed or they were all being treated. Now, many times with psychological drugs, you can't just give somebody, it's not like giving someone a Tylenol or giving someone a pain medication. Many times that the dosage and the types of drugs affect people differently. So most psychological medications, it's a little bit of trial and error with the doctor. So they give you a little bit, see how that works. Well, this didn't work so good. Let's give you this, a little stronger, a little less strong. And they kind of have to work it. And over time, the drugs can become less effective. So if you are not constantly seeing a professional who's watching how these drugs are affecting you, there's a good chance that, yeah, last year, this student was really good, but this year they're still taking the medication, yet the behaviors are changing or going back. There's a problem. Many times the SSRIs are not being prescribed correctly, and they're not being monitored correctly to be able to keep them up to date and working the way they're supposed to. And then there's the failing to take the medication. Is someone watching the kid take the medication? Are they suffering from the side effects or withdrawals from the medication because of the dosage is a little off? So while I'm talking about, the antidepressant and the school medication, it's important to understand that 97% of participants, when they've studied this, and the Department of Medical Epidemiology and Biostatistics in Stockholm did a study saying that violent acts were committed an average 26% higher during periods when individual SSRIs they were taking these drugs versus when they were not. Now, and there's studies like this out there, and a lot of them are fear-mongering because they say it's 26% higher. You have to understand only 3% of people taking these drugs actually committed acts of violence. So 97% did not commit anything. But it just goes to show you that almost all of these drugs were found on people who did commit them. And I'm not linking the drugs. No one's linking the drugs to these. If they are, they're not really linking it in a very responsible way. It's just showing that all of these children had mental issues going on. They were depressed. They were on anti-anxieties. They were being treated for some sort of psychological disorder. Now, you may not know what that is based on the fact if they don't tell you, or they don't bring you into the fold, or the parents don't mention it, or you don't see the behaviors outwardly, you may not know. But I found it that a lot of school professionals do understand and know when these kids are being treated, just because they do come in there. There has been cries for help. Some schools monitor the suicide hotline if they have one available to know which students are doing it. Sometimes their name is being given, sometimes they're not, but almost always these kids did reach out to somebody for suicide because of the mental illnesses they're having. So for the psychological issues, we want to look at the medication. Are they being treated for something? We know that there's a lot of people that are not diagnosed, but do they have the indications of especially depression? Because that's going to be one that comes into. So the antidepressants are big. So we want to look for elements of depression. And I'm going to show you why elements of depression really come into key and why. We're also looking for anxiety and paranoia. And now when we get into anxiety and paranoia, that's going to be when you get into their social assessments is when you should see them. But the three things we're looking for, anxiety, depression, paranoia, the three things we want to look at: the use of SSRIs and history of suicide for the psychological assessment part. Now, after you get into there, we're going to look at medical assessments. So if you're following along with me, the next section is going to be medical assessments. Medical assessment doesn't mean we need to see what their doctor is prescribing them or what their last physical was. Medical assessment, we're looking for signs of abuse. Do they come to school with obvious health issues? Now, every kid comes to school with something every once in a while, but we're looking for obvious health issues that we're not being cared for at home. Are there injuries for questionable reasons or not? And are they getting excessive medications or home use remedies? So if you have a child that is always sick, whether you see the signs of sick or they're always saying they're sick, they both are equally important. Obviously, if someone's constantly sick, where the student is always taking off for sickness, or they're always coming claiming of some ailment, or I was sick, I had this going on, that's showing signs they may not be cared for at the home. It could be other legitimate health issues, but we're looking for signs where their gut tells you they're not being cared for enough, and that's why they're getting sick. Injuries of questionable reasons or cause. Obviously, we can see the abuse angle there. And this is going to be, when we get into family assessment, this is what we're building on. Are they being treated well at home, or are they not being? Because the family dynamic has a huge deal here. If you're following on number 3, excessive medications, vitamins, or home remedy use, people that take excessive vitamins, medications, and things like that, either one, they have a lot of problems, or two, in their mind, they always think they have a lot of problems. So that's going to lead on to something a little bit later, but we're looking for these things. And unexplained or unusual amounts of sick time. And I look at these as more as some of the social assessment we're going to see in the social part build up. All of a sudden, is everything going fine? You see some indications on the social assessment, which we'll get to, and now we have unusual or unexplained sick days. Or maybe, as we've seen past, abuse occurs, there's marks, there's things going on, and unusual sick days. When the child wasn't sick, they weren't sick when they left, they're out 2 or 3 days, they come back, you don't see signs of real sickness, a little unexplained, or they can't give you a good reason for it. Maybe they're trying to hide injuries or whatnot. Are they getting the appropriate amount of sleep? Now, sleep isn't so much, I don't recall ever having enough sleep when I was in high school. When I was on my weekends, I seemed to sleep till noon. I seem to be always tired. And I think a lot of other kids are too. That time in your life, you need a lot of sleep because you're growing, you're going through puberty, lots of changes. So most people say teens need a lot more sleep than they normally get. But when I talk about appropriate amount of sleep, we're listening for keywords of I don't sleep well. Working in law enforcement, I'm sure if you've gone to a critical incident and you've been screened for PTSD afterwards, one of the first questions any psychologist is going to ask you when assessing for PTSD is going to be, how are you sleeping? And if you answer you're sleeping good, a lot of the other questions aren't so important, because true PTSD is going to affect your sleep. You're going to have bad dreams. You're going to wake up. You're not going to be able to sleep well. And that's one of the first things that they're going to ask you, because it's such an integral part of PTSD. Well, now let's look at someone who's not getting the appropriate amount of sleep. If teachers or you are talking to a student, say, hey, you look really tired. Yeah, I don't sleep well. Okay. That would be under the medical part of it and psychological, but we're looking at, are they getting the appropriate amount of sleep? And if not, why so? There could be other more appropriate reasons for it. They get up early, they have kids they have to take care of, they may be an oldest child is taking care of things, but they give you the more, I just don't get enough sleep. That should be an indicator right there that something may not be right. Now, jumping into social assessments. The social assessment is probably the biggest one that we want to look into. Now, perception of social standing with peers, coworkers, teachers, and supervisors. So we're looking at perception. You may not see it, teachers may not see it, but we're looking for, what does a student see? What do they have that's their social part that they think that's affecting their interpersonal skills? Now, many times, children in crisis or children that are going into crisis, they have a perceived at odds with their teachers, their bosses, or all authority figures. And you're going to say, well, that teacher hates me. This person hates me. Oh, officer, whoever doesn't like me. I'm always the bad one. They're going to have this at odds perception. Now, that plays into a couple things. One, if they're always feeling at odds with teachers, bosses, authority figures, law enforcement, who are they going to come to for help? If they feel they're that bad seed, if they feel that everyone hates them, everyone's against them. So we're looking for their perception, because their perception, remember, is everything. It doesn't matter what we see, it's matter what's in their head. We all talk about perception's reality with dealing with people. It really is true in this case. They may be a smart student, they may be personable or were personable at a time, but if they get this in their head, they're going to have some issues in coming forward. They're going to try and distance themselves from people that may be able to help them, all because of their at odds behavior. Now, we are going to see a slide most of the time when people are going down this road of crisis. You may see personal hygiene disappear. You may see, their willingness to engage in school-related activities or with friends. You might see that shrink back a little bit during these times. Well, that right there is also affecting their perception. When the student isn't doing their homework, when the child is not being as social, people kind of maybe move on. Maybe the teacher doesn't pay as much attention because there's other students that really want to learn and this one's kind of drifting away. Well, then there might be a perceived change in how they act. The coaches, the teachers, the school resource officers, there may be a different, we tend to treat people different in general. We treat people how they want to be treated. If students are active and eager, the teacher is going to treat them a little better than the kid who sleeps halfway through class and always has a poor attitude. It's just human nature how we treat people. We say, yeah, we treat everyone the same. That's very hard to do, especially for a teacher with maybe 20, 30 kids in a class. You're going to give the education and the attention to those who are there for it, and probably neglect in some way, shape, or form the ones who are not because of the time constraints you have. So we're looking for that perception, social standing. Now we see themes of bullying, persecution, or rejection. This kind of falls in the same way. Bullying or the perceived persecution by others is a huge indication right there. Now, I'm not saying every kid that gets bullied is going to have a problem. Most kids are bullied to some degree. Other kids have a perception of being bullied that may not be your typical give me your lunch money type of bullying. They have a perception, whether they don't feel good enough, whether they're shamed, whether they're bullied online. There's going to be that perception of being bullied, whether it's the actual, what we may be thinking of, a larger kid pushing around or threatening another child, but it could be just the perception of it. So we're always looking for the themes of bullying, feeling persecuted or rejected by groups. Now, how would we see this? You may not get to know your students that well. If you're a school resource officer in a school of 3,000 kids, it might be hard to get to know everybody, but we're looking for loners. We're looking for people that shy away from large groups of people, the ones that are eating their lunch by themselves, the one that walk through the hallway and avoid groups of people, not just the kids who might be your typical bullies, your typical jock type of bully. We're not looking for people that avoid only them, but people that are avoiding groups in general. Now, people are introverted, they may avoid groups, but normally you can tell whether someone just really doesn't want the company of large groups or whether someone's actively avoiding them because they feel they're not welcome. Now, there's a lot of behavioral indicators they can go into that. I'd be more than happy to go into that at a different time. Please let me know if that's something you want. But we normally have a good idea when people are ostracized out of groups versus whether they're just avoiding it and want to be by themselves for a day. So these are the things we're looking for, because whether they are or not truly ostracized, they may feel they are. It could be embarrassment. Something could have happened. They don't like me. They don't want to be around me. There may not be a lot of physical basis for it if we actually talk to people around them, but the feeling's there. And I don't mean to harp on that all the time about it's only what's in their head, but many times people had an idea that something bad was coming. They knew people were in crisis, but no one could tell why. We didn't dislike the kid. He could have come around anytime he wanted. He just chose not to. So it was definitely something in that person's head. It may not be something that was glaringly out in the open, like the person was being discouraged or pushed out of social groups. So this always feeds out on the social media at some point, especially now today. I didn't have social media when I was in high school, but now today, kids are very drawn to social media. There's different classes of bullying, online bullying, cyberbullying, shaming online. There's psychological disorders that come out of looking at some of the pictures on Instagram. If you read some of these, psychological or psychology articles on all these things. So what it's telling us, though, is social media is a huge factor in kids' lives today. No matter what parents want to do to keep you away from it, it seems to be a very large factor in a lot of kids. Everything's on social media today. What we see in the future, who knows what it could be, but I bet you we're going to see virtual reality in the future being a huge dominant factor in 10 years. Something to think about there too. But right now, social media. So many times social media is put out there. It could be people venting because of that keyboard warrior type of mentality where I can say this and no one's around, or I can voice my opinions on things where they may not have that real opinion, because many people try and get online and, poke the bear a little bit. But we're looking for, on social assessments, we're looking for themes of violence, lashing out, or unhealthy themes. Now, violence is something with kids you may or may not see. A lot of people grow out of it. Remember, especially guys, they have, a lot of the testosterone. They're, a little bit volatile at this age. So you might see themes of violence. You might see themes of, basically, not the healthiest of attitudes in that realm. But what we're looking for is violence as a theme, not violence as, oh, I'd kick that person's ass, or I don't like this, I hate this, we should beat those people up. Nothing like that. We're looking for it as a theme. Is it and you'll see it as a hatred or a demoralization against certain groups is what we're really looking for. It's not just the occasional, I hate this, or this is, putting violence online. We're looking for hating of certain groups. Now, it could be a lashing out. Are they being bullied? Do they not like a certain political group? Do they not like a certain social group, certain ethnic group? Those are all things we would look for because it's showing a group hatred. And now, if we skip ahead toward many of the school shootings that we can look at, a lot of times there was a target. It may not have been a specific person, but there was a group. The person was being bullied, so they went after the jocks. They went after this certain group. They felt ostracized, and they targeted certain things. So you're looking for a target of groups, or the group could be a school. The group could be a whole building full of people, or it could be just certain aspects of that. And that would go back to showing a lot of the social. Who do they feel objected or rejected by most? Who do they feel persecuted by the most? We're looking to see if these things come out. Children, especially, get highly emotional, and the emotional part is good because it gets things out on social media that we can see. Hopefully there's a way that you can monitor social media accounts of students where you go. Now, if not, this is good stuff to put out because other students will probably come and tell you that, hey, this person's threatening this group. This person says they hate this group. They're talking about shooting. They're talking about this. Now, we hear about shooting, that raises everyone's red flag. Oh, this person wants to shoot jocks because, he gets bullied all the time. That's going to show a lot of red flags, and rightfully so. It should. But there's a lot that goes on probably before someone said, I want to shoot somebody. There was probably mumblings in the social media world long before that probably we should have seen before. Now they put an act of violence in, and now what happens? In a lot of jurisdictions, now law enforcement comes in. Now you've committed a crime. Does that take away some of the services from the student? I don't know. Is this someone could have taken them under their wing a long time ago before it got to this point? Now you have law enforcement involved, you have crimes involved. How does that affect the child in the long run? That turns into a lot of different aspects there. So we want to look at, themes of violence, lashing out at certain groups, and generally unhealthy themes that we see. Now, also too, using his violence as entertainment. Many times when they look back at these school shooters, what was going on, they were using violence as a form of entertainment. Now, I like horror movies, but I don't get off on the actual killing of it. Normally, it's the story and the excitement that most people like. But when there are people that harp on the violence that you see in it, that basically get off on the actual violence of it, now you have a little bit of an issue right there. So we want to try and get into and find out what are we dealing with right there. So you may see this in video games, which video games obviously do come up as a big indicator now as far as what video games do. It also comes up as pornography. Right now pornography is a little bit different than it was years ago. It's a lot more accessible now than it was in the past, and that's a problem. But when it gets into the violent pornography, because kids are kids, boys are boys, they're all going to look. It's on right now. You don't need anything but a cell phone, and there's very little blocking on most internet searches right now, unless parental controls are employed. But not everyone has a parental control, and you can probably be able to find out someone who doesn't have one. So it's pretty open right now. But those who start talking about the violent pornography versus just curiosity and teen hormones. So we're looking for a lot that deal with the sudden fixation toward violence, whether it be in horror movies, whether it be in killing movies, whether it be in pornography and those type of things. Now, friendships come into play here too. Many times at the end, these kids in crisis start isolating themselves because you can already see there's a theme of persecution. There's a theme of at odds behavior with peers, with bosses, with authority figures. So you have all of this stuff going on as far as a theme of showing, hey, this is, I'm shying away from everyone socially. Now, friendships come into play here. What do kids most likely have as far as friendships? This is where it comes into a problem too, where a lot of these kids will start pulling back on their friendships. Many times these kids didn't have a lot of friends to begin with. They had a small group, one or two people. They weren't the people that you'd say as popular. They weren't the types that were the people like, oh, everyone likes this person, or everyone did like this person up until a certain point when they started withdrawing. And now we have people that are loners. They have one, maybe two friends. Their social relationships as far as interpersonal have failed, or they're failing. They may not be able to get a boyfriend or a girlfriend. They may not be able to keep those kind of relationships going. The friends that they do have are a little bit small. One friend, two friends in a school. It's not normally something that we have You know, you normally see kids in that age. Most of them have at least a core of friends, but a lot of acquaintances. We look for very little acquaintances, very few friends. So, and this is going to deal with lack of trust. This is going to say on the social, we already see how they're persecuted, friends and coworkers. They feel like they're bullied. They feel like they don't want people around. They turn a little bit more toward violence tendencies because of probably the frustration of not having those social outlets, and their friendships shrink or dwindle, maybe to one or two people, maybe small people, small groups of people. And this right here is where you see, who do they go to? Who are they gravitating toward? If you see people that are gravitating toward the same type of people, now you have an echo chamber. So you have two kids that are having issues and they gravitate toward each other. Yeah, there is, as friendships, there's going to be some sort of, commonality so they can talk to, but you also have possibly an echo chamber to where, this is happening to me. Oh, this is happening to me too. And now they tend to ratchet it up. Look at social media now. We're more divisive now as a nation than hardly ever before. A lot of that is probably due to social media, because social media, you tend to vent and post and talk about things with people that are like-minded, and therefore it ratchets up the emotional factor and the emotional communication coming out, and it kind of it feeds off itself. So we're looking for that when it comes down to this. So, and this may put a dampering on the person being able to cope with the daily stressors. Now, also in this social assessment, we're looking for how they react to other people. In many cases, these kids were seen after the fact of being easily frustrated, and they had a very diminished ability to cope with just the daily stresses and interpersonal conflicts and failures. So not only are they going down socially, they don't have the ability to handle the social aspects as they are. Many of these kids, the reason all this is happening is because they don't have the coping mechanisms for the social network of being in a school and all the dynamics, both good and bad, that come there. And one of the behavioral things you may see, since we're probably not in their friends group, is going to be easily frustrated, can't cope with the daily stresses. You might see them getting very stressed over little things that normally shouldn't stress out anybody. You go to class, you don't have the right book, you don't have pencils, your pen ran out. You're looking for an exaggerated stressor right there, because what's that showing? That's showing higher emotional flare-ups for things that are relatively not that big of a deal. Those frustrated moments combined with all the other parts of the social assessment should show you where this child is at. Now, we're social creatures. We're pack animals, if you look at it that way. We're social creatures. We want to be involved with people. We want to be involved socially. We crave it. People that are off on their own for long amounts of time, they put prisoners in solitary confinement for years and years. They don't come out psychologically well. We're made and designed to be around other people. So when we are isolated from them, it's not a good psychology environment. It's not good for the person, and they need to have that type of social training for later on in life. That's part of what high school is. It's part of what schooling is all about, is training you socially. Many times it doesn't come from the home. It has to come right there. And when students can't do it, that means they're either stopping it or they're not able to push through it, and they get frustrated and they get angry and they lash out and they feel that everyone's against them. This could lead to psychological issues. This could lead to health issues as well. So it's all tied in together. So now, going back a little bit, we're going to go into the family assessment. Now, like I said, this may not be something that you know too much about, but most of the time there's a little bit of these things that are known about the family. So we're looking for, is there a history of physical and sexual abuse? Now, that may not be something that's the easiest thing to find out, but it always seems to be that I've noticed that people do want to talk about these. They want people to know. They will reach out to guidance counselors. They may reach out to students. It may be very obvious. It may not be, but it's something that might be there. And it's something you can ask too. This can come up in certain times. Now we look at the family in general. Is there a history of abuse? Is it physical? Is it sexual? Is it a little of both? Is the person still there? So is this a constant stressor when they walk in the door? Or is this something that happened and moved on, like maybe a parent or step parent or boyfriend or girlfriend or uncle that was at one point, but now has moved out of the picture and not a constant source? Because if the person is continually being abused in one of those ways and that person is still present, that's going to create a lot of stressors in the home life. If they have stressors at school, where is their safe place? Now, I'm not talking about, oh, I need a safe space to talk about things that I want to talk about, but everyone needs a place where they can feel at ease. Everyone needs that one place where they can go to and not have to worry about all the different stressors and problems that life throws at you on a daily basis. For most people, it's home. But if that's taken away from somebody and the problems ratchet themselves up at school, that's a mix for someone just exploding. How they explode, that's going to be another issue. But we should be able to see these indications through mostly their social life, how they're being treated at home, and do they have a healthy environment? Are the parents or the family present and supportive? Do they have a positive role model, a social role model? It doesn't have to be a mom or a dad. It could be an uncle, it could be an older brother, it could be a neighbor, it could be somebody. But do they have a positive social role model? Someone that shows them how they're supposed to act, how they're supposed to engage with their peers, with the opposite sex, because we're learning how to build those relationships at this point, both romantic, getting along with groups of people, getting along with teachers. It's all building stuff for later on in life. Do they have a role model to bring them through? There's differences in kids, people that are raised with only a mother versus only a father. You can see differences. They didn't learn from that one sex. They didn't have a relationship to look at. Children look at their parents as they're, modeling their relationship with others, because that's normally the only people they have around. Now, if there's a lot of people around, they're using all these relationships to build their guide on how they're going to relate to other people. If they didn't have this growing up, then there's deficiencies. And obviously deficiencies like that are going to show themselves in the child's socialization during school hours. So we look for the fact that they're going to have, do they have positive role models? A large amount of people that do go to the school shooting limit didn't have a positive role model. Their parents were either not in the picture, or they weren't positive role models. They may have been in trouble. They may have been abusive. They may have just been non-existent. Now, in many cases, people that have gone to school shooters, kids that were in crisis, during the time they were in crisis, the school noticed a good amount of these and went to students, parents, and said, hey, we're noticing these problems. And they got apathetic parents. They got people that were not engaged and may not have reacted to the news of troubling behavior for whatever reason. It could be they just felt, hey, listen, these are teen years. Kids are a little bit weird. Kids are all messed up at this time, which, okay, we can all say, yeah, kids are in their teen years. We're all a lot different. We all did some things back then that we wouldn't really consider normal now. As adults, they may have just kind of, oh, these are just kids, or they may just not have cared. And we see that. We may know that. We meet people like this, that they just don't care. Yeah, it's nothing. Or they don't have the ability, the finances, or the time to even do it. You have some parents that are working 2 and 3 jobs to keep food on the table. They just might not be there enough to notice it or be able to do anything about it if they wanted to. These are all the situations you have to worry about. Many times it's apathetic. The parents just don't engage. They know the kid has issues, but they just don't engage. Either the hope that they'll grow out of it, it's just a phase, or the apathy of just not caring. Could be a little of each. So also too with the family, our parents, there's been a couple instances where parents fear the children. And this has come right out in some of the case studies with school shootings, where the parents they placated the children to avoid outbursts because they were afraid of their own children. Now, this sounds like a weird thing to say, but I've seen this several times in my law enforcement career, and I venture to say I'm not the only one that has seen parents that either feared the child being physically violent toward them, or just feared the outburst and placated behaviors because they just don't want to deal with what comes afterwards. I've seen that go both ways, something that you have to kind of think about. So, and this kind of plays into when you have that type of parenting dynamic, there's a history of not understanding consequences because maybe the child never had to deal with consequences. And this will be evident in their social lives about not understanding what consequences really deal with it. In theory, they may understand it, but it might not be something they truly understand because they never had to really deal with significant consequences because their family life is either one, problematic, abusive, apathetic, and just non-avoidance, or no one's really been around enough to kind of really employ the discipline they need to. And they may have been generally good kids up until a certain point, but we're going to see where they kind of go down a different route. So these are some of the family dynamics that I want to get into. And also, too, does the family have a history of mental illness? Have you dealt with the family members and realized there's something not right? Maybe this parent doesn't have the ability or doesn't have the wherewithal or the psychological abilities to understand, hey, there's an issue. Also, too, is there an intimacy issue with the family? I'm going to get into some of the case studies at the end of this to show you. But many times it's reported there's no intimacy. There is a one case that we'll look at where the person said they never got a hug from their parents their entire life, never. If someone was to mention that to me, the first thing I would be wondering is, is how this kid's going to be socialized, how this person's going to be socialized. I mean, there's a lot you can take from that statement, but the first thing I'm going to look at is this person's going to have a lot of problems with the opposite sex because they have no history, formal training, family training, any kind of experience with any kind of intimacy. Now, I'm not talking about sexual abuse. I'm talking about just intimacy in general. That's a big part of adult relationships. It's a big part of friendships sometimes. So if you have no way of knowing what that's about, I would venture to say there's a good chance your relationships with other peers, and especially the opposite sex, is going to be problematic. So when you hear things like this, understand where the family is. Now, that just might be how that family is. And I guess there's nothing wrong with it, nothing illegal about it that I can see, but it definitely shows this is going to affect kids' social assessment. Their social behaviors are going to be affected by how they're treated at home, how they're raised, how they're seen. And these are just things that you may catch on to as you talk to people. And now we get into the red flag assessments. Now, the red flag assessments are kind of like the last bit. You're going to have students in crisis, people that you're going to see that are going to have psychological issues. They're going to be depressed. They're going to be anxious. They might be paranoid. People are out to, everyone's against me. Everyone's out to get me. This person doesn't like me. This person doesn't like me. So I'm going to withdraw into my cocoon. They have issues. They don't sleep well at night, the medical issues. They have bruising and things that, oh, yeah, I fell. Oh, yeah, I did this. Those are big issues, and as they compound. Now, social settings, they're withdrawing from other people. They're limiting their social interactions with a very few set of people that may be very like-minded and like behavior. They feel like everyone else is against them. They lash out against groups. They dehumanize others. They hate certain groups. They have certain violent tendencies toward different things, whether it could be a political statement, it could be a certain group of people, but they're lashing out emotionally. Are these emotions appropriate or something you're going to have to kind of look into? We all have things we love and we hate, and frequently we lash out about them. And that's natural, especially on social media, because there's so much bait to lash out against something you like or don't like on social media. That's one form. The other form is the part where you bring it up to the table. Not you see a political post that's opposed to your beliefs and you lash out, I hate when this person does this. This is bad. This person should be in office. That's one thing. The other part is when you bring out things and then have an emotional lash against them. You're going to see different parts of violence. The violence may be either lashing out or talking about violence or talking about getting even, those kind of things. That creeps into themes of violence, such as video games, pornography, movies, things like that, where they talk about that more or lean toward, posting about things like that more. Now, all this with a problematic family history. Sexual abuse, physically abused, no supportive family, no role models, no one for us to even go talk to and say, hey, your kid's having problems. We want to get him into some kind of special problems or special programs because of these kind of issues. And then the intimacy with the family. Is there intimacy issues? Do they have the social training for intimacy later on in life? All these things are going to be children in crisis. This is where we should be reaching in and trying to get them with a counselor, with a peer group, with something, whether it just be a teacher that they can go talk to. These are the kind of people that need an outlet. They need to talk and be able to work through these systems. And sometimes it just may be a role model. Sometimes it just may be somebody that they can vent to, or just someone reaching out and saying, hey, not everyone hates you. A teacher reaching out, an SRO, school resource officer reaching out, or someone in the school reaching out to be their friend, to let them know, hey, you're not a bad kid. I like you. And realizing that maybe the world's not against them. Maybe psychological counseling. Do we get them to a counselor? Do you have a system set up to deal with children in crisis like this? Because these are crisis. This person has showed you, just based on this part of the assessment, that they don't have a way out. And when we don't have a way out, we start spiraling down. Home is problematic. School is problematic. No friends, possibly some psychological issues. Where's the way out? There's none. And when you start circling, now you're in crisis, significant crisis. At this point, what happens? When we're in crisis, just like the mind, when it's in a state of confusion, it doesn't have direction, it'll latch on to whatever it finds. If it latches onto the wrong thing, now this child can go down the wrong tube. Now, just say they stay in this mode of crisis and they graduate. There's a good chance all this could change and turn around. They need to make it through school because they can get out and now they're not governed by the same social rules. Maybe they join the military. Maybe they go to a college where things are different. Maybe they just get a job and find something they enjoy. And now this person could turn themselves around. That's why people say, when I go through this and start talking about some of these people that went to that were school shooters, they're all going to have this, a lot of these signs. Now, you may be saying, I know kids that have all of this. Well, they're in crisis. I've known kids in the past that had this, and now they're decent students. They're decent people. They're adults now. They have families. Could very well be. A lot of kids have a lot of these things going on in their lives, and they do make it past a point. They do make it to a point where this stuff goes away, or they get into a better situation, or just a different situation where these weren't such a big deal. Because let's just face it, as a high school student, a middle school student, you're governed by a lot of rules. You have to show up at school. You have to do certain things. If you don't do certain things, you don't get good grades, you get in trouble. There's a lot of rules put on them at a time when we're naturally rebellious. So even the good, well-adjusted kids still are governed down and tapped down by rules. What makes them get through it okay is good socialization, a good understanding of consequences, a good understanding of what they need to do. And they have a lot of peer support group going along that way, with the teachers, with friends, with family, to get themselves through the hard times. But these students don't. The students in crisis don't have any of that. So while they're in this state of crisis, now we're looking for more themes of violence, of the frustration of their situation. Dress, social media, writing, art, scribblings on books, doodles, or whatever. We're looking for, is violence become a constant theme in their life? Like I said, no kid woke up in the morning, it was well adjusted, and said, you know what, I'm gonna go shoot the place up today and walk out and shoot it. It just doesn't happen. Unless there's a mental issue there, like schizophrenia or something, because it's an external belief system that it doesn't happen normally. So What we're dealing for is, now we have very overt talk about violence? Is there violence toward animals, toward other people? Are they bullying kids smaller than them? Are they cruel to people outside their little groups? Is there a more sudden, now there's probably already a withdrawal, but is there a sudden withdrawal from all social circles? School, family, work. Did they quit their job? Did they stop going to any kind of sports or clubs they were doing? Have you basically now seen them just basically disappear from the social circuit at school? Said, we know there's limited, diminished social interaction already, but now does everything seem to get cut off? People talk about weapons, and I want to go into weapons at this point. Lots of kids have access to weapons. Access to weapons is not an indicator. I grew up in a law enforcement family. There was weapons all over the place. I had access if I wanted to find them. I'm sure I could have went and found them earlier on. My dad hunted. I hunted as a young kid. I was around weapons because my dad was in law enforcement. A lot of his friends, other family members in law enforcement. So I grew up around weapons, and I turned out fine. But access to weapons isn't the issue. But when it becomes the plan, obviously that's the issue. So you want to know, does this person have access to weapons? Now, then comes into, if they don't have it, could they get access to weapons? Depending on where you are, that might be something that you might be in a school where there's an element that might be able to get weapons on the street, or there may not be, depending on where you are. But we want to always know what the access to weapons are. Once you see everything outside the red flag series, I would want to know about weapons. If you talk to family, do you have weapons in the house? Is this something the kid has access to? If you have family members that will talk to you, will respond to you, is this something they can do? Now, it's not the only reason. Neighbors, extended family members, there has been instances where weapons were gotten from extended family members and also neighbors and friends. But it is obviously a red flag. If the person's talking about weapons or talking about access to weapons, that means it's going on up here. It's coming out of their mouth. Very few people keep secrets very well, especially when you're in crisis, especially when you're very emotional. People talk more. Secrets are going to come out. You hear violence. Now you also hear access to weapons. Obviously, we don't need to dwell on that too much. There's a problem there. Are you noticing an absence or difference in prescription medications, starting, stopping, severe mood changes? If you've been around people that are on psychological medications for any amount of time, that you notice there's normally a difference when they're taking them, and sometimes you can tell when they're off. And you're like, hey, this person's acting a little different today. Are they on medications? Just like with any other drug. Someone doesn't drink, they come to work drunk, you can normally tell, if not from the behavior, it's just a change in the behavior from the day when they were sober. A lot of psychological medications are the same way. Many times they may be a little more subdued while they're on the medication, and you realize the person's not taking their medication anymore. I can tell. If you know the person's baseline, the behavioral baselines, you may notice changes. Starting, stopping, mood changes, dosing changes. They may tell you, hey, I got changed my medication. You may notice different changes in them, and that change could spur on different behaviors. Verbalizations of violence and suicide, revenge. I'd say probably a large amount of high school students think about suicide at one point in their life. I think most people have contemplated suicide in most part of their life, or at least in one part of their life have thought about it. The key is most people just kind of, that's not really a good option, and you move on. Whereas when there's verbalizations of violence, suicide, and revenge, those three things normally should indicate violence, verbalization of violence. These people should all get killed. It's going to, fine. It would be okay with me if someone comes in and shoots this place up. If someone killed all those people, I wouldn't even care. Verbalizations of violence. Revenge would kind of come along the same way. If anyone was going to shoot anybody, I hope it's those guys, because they're just bad. Oh, those people over there, they're just, they just do this, this, and this. They don't even deserve to be around here. For everything they've done to people, they should get this to them. The revenge. Now, the suicide ones, no one even cares if I'm around. I don't think anyone would even notice if I wasn't even here anymore. If I died, I don't think anyone even noticed. I wonder how many days people would go by to realize I'm not even at school anymore. It doesn't always have to be suicide. You get these verbalizations of taking yourself out of the picture. And would it matter? Would it be noticed? Or would it be better for everybody if I wasn't around? These are some of the things we listen for. Very few times do people say, I'm going to take a bunch of pills and kill myself. This happens again. That might not be what they're going to come out and say, but they're talking about the underlying things that we want to look for, verbalizations that deal with them. Because verbalizations, especially about things that are more taboo than others, going into school, talking about violence, suicide, shootings, revenge on certain people. If people talk about these things, especially unprompted, that means it's rolling around in here. And if it's rolling around in here to the point to where it comes out, that means it's probably kind of focused on here, where they're thinking about it a lot. And now to hear people come out and say this stuff, now let you know, okay, this isn't just a passing thought that kind of came by because of something that happened. This is something that's rolling around inside their head. Now, you may not hear these as a teacher, as a police officer, as a school worker. You may not be the ones to hear these things, but there probably people are going to come and talk to you. In many cases, people said they knew something was going to happen. In a lot of school shooting reports, people came to them. School knew something's not right. Psychologists said something's not right. Peers shied away from these people because something wasn't right. They were acting in ways where people were worried. They were afraid. This is what happened. So when you hear these things, whether by teachers, whether by students that know them, or whether just by you see these behaviors happening, remember, everybody knew at one point before it happened, where everyone suspected something wasn't happening. Something was definitely wrong with this student before these things happened. And it went unaddressed, or how it was addressed was not effective. And therein lies part of the problem. What do we do? At this point, if you have these issues, what does your school or your organization or your department have as far as dealing with this? Most don't have much. Most think what we'd call law enforcement. We'd send them to counseling. Sure, law enforcement, okay, maybe. Counseling, sure, that's a better option, but can you mandate someone to go to counseling? Maybe, maybe not. What I'm saying is, if they don't work, what is your plan? Now, I don't have a clean, break to say, oh, this is what you do. It's going to be something that you're going to need to work through or have a plan already set up ahead. Now, the one thing I did want to go into is one of the things that you see at the end. As we talked about the student in crisis, now we see red flags. Now we know that these thoughts are in people's head. They may have mentioned school shooters. They may have talked about Columbine. They may have talked about Stoneman Douglas. They may have talked about some of the other big names that you hear time and time again. But they haven't done anything yet. In a lot of cases, what people see as the last breaking straw on that camel's back is a loss of some kind, whether it be a relationship that they needed that was holding them together. Maybe they broke up with their boyfriend or girlfriend. Maybe a friend that they had that was kind of holding them together left the area, is not friends with them anymore, maybe died, maybe a pet they were very attached to, a divorce, a grandparent, an uncle, a father, a mother, someone who was the thing that was holding them together now is gone. Now you have all that crisis, you have all these red flags, and that one person or thing may have been holding them together. The pet, the dog, the uncle, the neighbor, somebody, and they lost, they moved away. They died. They're out of the picture now. They broke up. Now the person has nothing. The one thing they had pulling them together now is not there. Now where does that person go? Doesn't have to be a student to think when people are having all this going on, there's no safe place for them, not home, not school, not work. There's no safe place in life. They lose the last thing to hold the glue together. They already have a lot of issues rolling around their head now. Now is when you're going to see someone lash out because what else do they have going on for them? And this is frequently what we see at this point. Now, all this is tainted by the possibility of some psychological issues going on as well, and by medications maybe playing a little bit of havoc with your psychological and emotional system. So this is a perfect stew. This is not one thing that you see. This is a stew we've thrown together that something bad is going to come out of, or there's a strong potential to. Now, I will not say ever, because I don't believe it, that someone who hits every one of these aspects is going to be a school shooter. It's not the case. That's the problem. But this is the breeding ground that one's going to come from when the right set of circumstances now leads on. It's going to be the one time after this where they get their lunch money taken, or someone turns them down for the prom, or a teacher yells at them because they maybe deserved it, but it happens. Or the little things, the little stresses that they just have a hard time dealing with because of their socialization now is going to be a much bigger factor. And that's when they're going to lash out. And if they have access to weapons, if they have that wherewithal, it's going to be. Many times they've even practiced, as we'll see in a few of them. So now I want to go on to some key statistics. The FBI and Secret Service have thrown together some amazing statistics that deal with these students. And some of the statistics, I won't bore you with all of the reading, but I just want to go on a couple. When people have these are actual school shooters. 63% of attackers had a history of weapon use, which means they had experience with the firearms. 68 acquired the weapons they used from their own home or that of a relative. 93% of attackers engaged in some behavior prior to the attack that caused others to be concerned. 93% of the attackers planned out the attack in advance. 61% were motivated by revenge or retribution. 75% felt bullied, persecuted, or threatened by others. 62% of the attackers had dominant themes in their lives of depression, anxiety, and paranoia. And only 25% were diagnosed with a mental illness. So these are just some of the percentages of the ones that were actually shooters, that actually went forth with extreme violence. But if you look back at these, these are bad numbers. These are showing that the majority of these people followed the same path. And that's the good part about this, is that they're all going down the same path, which means there's a chance, if we recognize that path and have safeguards set in place, like threat assessments, like counseling, like some sort of intervention for them, that there's a chance that we can derail them off that path. So it's both good and bad. They're following the same path with the same issues because now it's recognizable. It forms a profile that we can use. And that right there is really in one of the better parts of this, is to show that. Okay, now let's look at some people. Let's see how real this stuff is and how true this is to some frequent or some past school shooters. So I'm gonna tell you some of the people that had this. They had Nicolas Cruz, who was one of the Stoneman Douglas High School, where he was the Stoneman Douglas High School shooter. Afterwards, and if you look, and I believe I have it in your file, is one of the reports done by the Secret Service and FBI on an after-action report on a lot of these. And if you don't have it, you can look online to get the after-action reports where the FBI and the local law enforcement do put together quite a good packet as to the history of these students. And you're going to find out they follow the threat assessment pretty spot on. So let's look at Nicolas Cruz, first of all. He had a fixation and access to weapons. And there was a lot, if you look on videos, he has a lot of videos, social media videos of him being pretty angry, talking about weapons, talking about different groups of people and whatnot, where it was out there. He heard voices telling him to attack. So we have psychological issues going on there. He lashed out frequently on social media, had some homicidal statements that he threw out. And a lot of his statements dehumanized because he hated other groups. He took certain groups and just dehumanized them. He planned the attack, very abusive toward animals. And he made homicidal statements. He recently lost his mother. His mother died a few months before the shooting. I would imagine they were close. After the shooting, there were others that were worried he would do something. Some people came forward. Some people knew there was changes before there was a breaking point, and people saw the changes and they were worried he was going to do something based on all his statements, based on his background, based on his behaviors over the past, in the past. So they knew something was going to happen. A lesser known one, because it's a college. I'm gonna butcher his name, as I do every time. It's Sion Hugh Cho, who was the Virginia Tech shooter a few years back. Again, fixation and access to weapons. He had a very turbulent romantic history, very hard times with the opposite sex. He was seeing a counselor for it, and the counselor wrote in his notes, troubled. And one of his professors noted that he was a troubled loner. So people saw that he was out there. Now, he was diagnosed with major depressive disorder, severe anxiety, and selective mutism. And the selective mutism just means he couldn't talk. He wouldn't talk around certain groups of people, whatever, So when he got stressed out, he would stop talking altogether. Depression, anxiety, it's pretty significant anxiety if you have selective mutism, and made suicidal statements. Planned the attack. He felt persecuted and rejected by others. He made a lot of videos before the attack where he talked about, some of these issues. He was bullied as a child, and he's the one that said that his family never hugged him. He was never hugged by his mom or his dad. So all of these thrown in together, it's hitting so many points on the threat assessment. Now, one that is an interesting one, but shows a little the mental illness aspect, is Charles Whitman. Now, if you don't recognize Charles Whitman climbed on top of a tower in Austin, Texas, on the campus of the University of Texas with a rifle and started shooting people on the tower below. This happened in the 60s. It was he was older though, wasn't a student, but it was right there in the middle of Austin, Texas. Now, he's a little bit different because he was a little older, but he might have had some psychological issues and physical issues that dealt with this. Now, he had a fixation and access to weapons. He was a former Marine, had a very abusive childhood, suffered from depression and anxiety, and he tried to seek help for his violent thoughts. He went out, tried to get to a psychologist. He tried to talk about it, and he was actually considered to be a very adjusted, popular child, but violent outbursts. And he journaled about his thoughts. He had a lot of thoughts of violence. He had a lot of thoughts about social anxiety. He couldn't get along with people, but he was an intelligent person. He had an IQ of 138, which is significantly higher than the average. And he, like I said, he was a United States Marine, served in the Marine Corps, and was discharged for violent outbursts. So they weren't, people always bring it up. So you were too violent for the Marines. It wasn't so much that he was too violent. It was that he would have outbursts because he had trouble dealing with some of the basic life stressors, to where he was always looking for a fight because he just couldn't handle the social interactions. He got highly frustrated, and when he got frustrated, he turned right to violence. Now, he had a brain tumor. In fact, one of his journals and letters he wrote before he went in the shooting said, "Please look at my brain because I think there's something wrong with me." And they did. They looked in his brain. He had a tumor. Now, there are instances where tumors lead to violent behaviors, and that's just something good to know for you, but he still followed a lot of the threat assessment. And yes, if they say, well, the tumor is the reason that he did this, okay, maybe that's the case. But he still followed a lot of the other threat assessments. And it's important to realize that sometimes it's not going to be 100% out there in the open. Not everything is going to be down the threat assessment. And this threat assessment is not meant to be the end all be all. You can, just use this and nothing else, but it's giving you the path to start going down and understand that these things all lead to someone in crisis, and people in crisis that run out of options tend to do things that are extreme. Now we have Adam Lanza, who was the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooter. Again, fixation and access to weapons. Obviously, that's always going to be an issue because weapons are used. Parents were divorced, lacked intimacy as a child. He had a history of anxiety and a developmental disability. His mother failed to address his mental issues. The school went to him. The school was concerned for his behavior, went to his parents and said, listen, there's issues. You need to deal with these issues. And they went untreated, despite several warning signs. So with him, everything was right there. And even the school went there, but the parents maybe divorced, maybe apathetic, maybe they weren't good parents. I don't know, but they went untreated. And a lot of it, I think, is kids act strange. Most of the time, though, kids grow out of it, right? We all tell ourselves, well, the kids act a little bit strange, but they grow out of it. How many times do you hear that for advice as a parent? As a parent, I've heard it a lot of times, oh, don't worry about your kid, it grows out of it. A huge deal of behaviors, that's probably the case. But there are some that you have to look and say, this is not a growing out of behavior. This is something that needs to be dealt with, especially when professionals tell you that there are issues involved with this. So I've gone through some indications of what could be on an assessment, on the threat assessment, giving you a couple ideas on how to deal, with them as far as understanding them, giving issues that they have to be dealt with when they're still in the crisis level for the best way to being able to deal with them effectively. Now, giving you examples of how people that did these things followed the threat assessment, followed the same path for the most part, whether they were more psychologically induced because of mental illness issues like Charles Whitman, or bullied, abused, rejected children like most of the other ones are. So this is how I teach a threat assessment. And I know that there are other groups and agencies that have threat assessments that are pretty good. I know that the FBI, the behavioral services up there, they do have classes on these. The FBI does. Many of the state investigation does. I know the Florida Department of Law Enforcement has investigations. The Secret Service collects a lot of information on these. So there are different groups out there that have threat assessments, as well as on the psychology side, counselors, that there are certain groups that have, different threat assessments. Mine is just one tool, and I hope you understand that it's a tool. A good way of doing these things should have a toolbox. You should have multiple ways to be able to look, because every situation is different, every class is different, and social settings are always different, whether depending on your school or where you're doing this from. So that is the threat assessment. Finished a little earlier than I want to. I allotted myself an hour and a half for this. I'm a few minutes early, and I'd like to open it up if anyone has any questions or anything that they would like to speak about as far as this goes. If no one does, then I feel like I just did that good of a job. Does anyone have any questions or anything? Okay, I'll take that as a good job. What I'd like now to, if you go back to your where you logged into to get on this, I know that I sent you the Zoom link in an email, but if you go log on to your account that you made in order to get access to the class, you'll find the threat assessment there, as well as in the chat. You'll also find other links and articles and things that I've included in this, as well as you can look at other training in other classes. In the other training that I have, I talk about this part of it a little bit more in depth, but I also go into how do you speak to students, There's different questioning methods that I've used with students, because a lot of times you're not in a custodial environment where you have the rules of interrogation. You're just trying to get some information out of children. Because remember, nothing on this threat assessment really is a crime. And almost every one of these is nothing that really law enforcement can forcibly act upon. So you have to have a different questioning. And I use a certain questioning mannerism to help students kind of get things out. So if you want to take the additional class, or this will be a class I may offer in the future as far as talking to people, interview techniques, please keep looking on there. I will send out announcements on that format to help you look at these. And if no one has any questions, this concludes the webinar. I'm going to stop the recording.